So thank you so much, Ruth, for doing this. Ruth DeFries is an amazing scientist. I've read her work for a long time and was introduced to her work mainly about the deforestation in the Amazon. So I'm very, very happy that she's here with us. She talked to the class. And Ruth, I've been very curious about how you moved from more this land use change dynamics that you did in your PhD, if I'm not mistaken, but in a very different time scale, and how you shift to more this modern land use change that we see today in your research.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's great to be with you. It's great to see you again, and hello, all the students out there who unfortunately I can't see. So I started out caring very much about forests, as we all do, and tropical forests and deforestation being a big environmental issue, and trying to figure out a niche to be able to start to work with remote sensing data when the field was pretty wide open in terms of figuring out methods to be able to monitor deforestation and use satellite data in automated ways. And so I was very lucky to be able to sort of come in at that time. And I was extremely lucky to start working in Brazil. I had been working at a somewhat global scale with satellite data, and then a really pivotal opportunity for me was in the LBA, and to be able to work with INPE, the Brazilian Space Agency, on deforestation monitoring, and particularly to get out on the ground and see what was actually going on, not too far, right where you are now, Paulo, in Mato Grosso. And that was just so eye-opening to me. I mean, you can look at satellite images forever, but when you see what's going on the ground, you just get a completely different sense. So so working on the remote sensing side, that's all very important. But then I started seeing, this is just so much more complicated than algorithms and pixels. You have all the governance issues, the people, the equity, the land tenure, in addition to all of the ecological processes. And it's just this complex morass. And while that's really hard to work with, it's also to more place-based, more people-oriented thinking. If we're really going to make headway to understand these problems, and understanding is the first step towards contributing to solutions. So I worked for a few years in Brazil, which is wonderful. Shall I keep going? Shall I just keep talking?
Yeah. I have a couple questions. So one of the questions I have for you, because I'm super curious, after working in Brazil for a long time, and then in parts of Peru, in the Amazon, and in Brazil in general, South America, you really focus your work in India and some parts of Southeast Asia. And I was just curious to know sort of what it was strikingly different or similar when we went from this, the space with a lot of variety, but some large scale agricultural landscape, and then went to India. How did you compare at the time?
Yeah. So I started out, I mean, India is my second home, literally, and my husband's from India. I lived in India. It's really where I feel very connected, very long-term connected. And I always, I always wanted to work in India, but it's a really tough place to work. Brazil is not that easy, but India is really, really tough to get in. So that was always in my sights. So when I started working in Brazil, I was coming from a kind of India perspective. That was my perspective from being on the ground. And when I got to Brazil, I was like, wow, where is everyone? It's such a low population density. It's just so incredibly different in some ways. But in other ways, it's very similar in terms of pressures on forests, different kinds of pressures, but big pressures on forests. In India, the pressures are more, well, there's many pressures, but there are more pressures in terms of local use, people getting their daily cooking energy from fuel wood in forests and relying on forest products for their livelihoods. It's just a sort of closer day-to-day connection from local people. Although I know that that is also true in the Amazon and forests in Brazil, but the scale is very different. So it's kind of similar, just very different ends of the continuum. But I find it really fascinating to be able uh, to see those different processes, how they play out in different places, um, and try to think about the differences and the similarities. Another big similarity is the importance of land tenure. Like in Brazil, you have all the issues around, who gets to decide. You have big indigenous areas, and in India, you have the same thing. It's just basically um, land tenure is such a fundamental aspect of what happens in forests and who decides what happens. So that's a far cry from remote sensing algorithms, but when you get on the ground, you just can't help it. You just get into all of these complicated
Cool. And I
issues.
was just curious, yeah, once we traveled to the Amazon and you were sort of, we were driving all over the place. And then there's all this new, I would say, I think, concern with forests, with a big, large scale agriculture moving into this frontier. And I was just wondering sort of how did you see that shift? How in that moment it compared to other historical moments that have been studied across the globe?
Yeah. Oh, I would love to do that again. Circle the Xingu. That would just be so much fun to do that. Let's do that again and see the changes. But it's so amazing to be right at the frontier at the time when the frontier is opening up. I mean, at some time or other, every place has been a frontier. The U.S. was a frontier, in the mid 1800s, late 1800s, and other parts of the world are frontiers at different points in time. So at the time, I mean, now it's a little bit less. The frontier is kind of moved up, I guess, a bit. But at that time, the first trip I took from Cuiabá to Sinop was there was no road. There was literally a dirt road, and it took, I don't know, maybe 12 hours. And then every time I kept going, it was just like more stores and fancy stuff, and then you see, oh, some, and you just to see the progression of the frontier is just really something. And you can imagine how that plays out in different parts of the world. In India, it's the same thing. In the area where I work in central India, I've watched this. It's not a frontier. It's settled agricultural land was cleared, the major part of it a long time ago. But to see the infrastructure move into forests and to see the expansion of cities. So in a way, it still is a frontier in terms of development and impacts on the forest, and the driving question, which is how do you accommodate these development needs, which are very real? I mean, roads are important, yeah, but how do you accommodate that in a way that maintains the function and everything we love about forests?
So along these lines, I was just wondering, when I started paying attention to conservation, there is a little bit of a shift in paradigm that we should conserve forests, right? That we should keep people away and then create these big protected areas. Of course, there's a role for that, but there's a shift with Chico Mendes and the extractive reserves, and actually people were effective in protecting forests in many occasions. And I imagine that in India, it is a bit harder to see these huge chunks of forest without any human interaction. And where do you see the debate nowadays with this debate? Well, we need people in the forest to conserve it, from we need no people in the forest to conserve it.
Yeah, so that debate plays out a lot in India. So there is success with protected areas and tiger reserves, and the country has an amazing amount of wildlife considering the population density and the pressure. So it's quite impressive that there is as much wildlife as there is, and some of that is due to protected areas, but there are very big debates about exactly this kind of fortress conservation versus inclusive people-oriented conservation. So there is movement of people um, outside to move people outside of protected areas. So that's a big issue. Uh, but more importantly, I think a shift in conservation has been to recognize that uh, it's just you cannot have enough protected areas to conserve every place that we need to conserve to maintain ecosystem services and and functions and options for the future. Uh, that that conservation now, I think, is more about landscape level conservation. We have protected areas, but very importantly, how do we keep the diversity and keep the ecosystem function in places that are not under strict protection? And that plays out a lot in India because the protected areas are very small. In Brazil, there are very large protected areas, but in India they're tiny. Uh, so so there's wildlife needs to move between them, and the ecosystem services that are provided by places in between protected areas are really important for people, particularly water, downstream water. So the conservation, at least the way I think about conservation, is only partly about protected areas, but more at this landscape level. And that's also true in California. If you think about the range of species across California, you think about Yellowstone to Yukon. So I think landscape level conservation and the role of lands outside of protected areas is really an important piece of conservation now. Now that gets very complicated very fast because once you go outside of this management entity, which is a protected area, you get into very messy things of who makes the decisions, who has the mandate, who owns the land. You know, you have conflicting values, you have different stakeholders, and it gets pretty interesting.
So you've written a lot about the frontier governance, right? When we get there, we can regulate some of the process. We can talk to some actors, they follow the law. But in many cases, we don't have much forest left at this point. So how do you compare these places in terms of governance? Do people follow the law, the government enforces, or there's some incentives that play a role in shifting the way people deforest or clear land or use natural resources? How do you see this in India and in Brazil?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know much more about Brazil, but it's quite always been amazing to me. I know there's a lot of controversy about the forest code, but it's just so incredible that there is one at all. That you're talking about people's private land and telling
Yes.
them what they can do on their private land. That would be really hard to get away with in the U.S.
What about
Um,
India?
India, well, when I talk about India, I'm talking about my specific research area, which is the center part of the country, which is one of the remaining places where there is some forest. It's a globally important area for tiger conservation. It's part of a tribal belt, so there are tribal communities in India that are very highly concentrated in this particular area. That's another similarity with the Amazon, but very different in terms of the history and current um, status of the indigenous peoples. Um, and um, and there's very much a British legacy of the government basically owning all forest. Pretty much all forest in India is owned by the government. So there's a lot of that creates a lot of tension because the local people who are very poor and are very dependent on the forest for livelihood needs, for fuel wood, for grazing their livestock, for selling non-timber forest products, for basically forests are the core of their livelihoods. So there is quite a lot of tension around that, around local people needing to depend on the forest, but the forests are basically managed by the government. And what I have come to appreciate is the work of Eleanor Ostrom. I don't know if you get into that in your class at all, but the whole idea that if people have have control over their let's make it forest, control over their forest, and have the ability to manage it and monitor it, and their livelihoods depend on it, then it is possible, it's not necessarily the case, but it is possible that people will do a better job managing their own resources than top-down government. So, Nepal is a really strong example of community forests, and there's some examples in India. Um, I'm not exactly sure how that plays out in Brazil, but I've come to go back and read and reread Eleanor Ostrom. She won a Nobel Prize. Uh, and her message was, it is possible if the conditions are right, for people to self-organize and manage their own resources.
Yeah, David McGrath has some really nice studies in the Amazon about the lakes that form during the dry season and how the communities have to get together and organize themselves to manage the lakes as a common resource. And that is a very interesting sort of set of ideas. And
so it's very interesting. Yeah. So in India, it's very hard to, it's a really complicated question because the forests are essentially managed by the government, and there's laws about community rights for local people to have control over their forests, and that is there's some really conflicting legal kinds of situations, and there's a lot of legal battles that are going on about community forest rights, and a lot of debates, and in a way, and a lot of debate within the conservation community itself. So some conservationists will say, if you let people manage their own resources, there's such pressure because there's so much population that we'll have a lot of threat. That's a big threat. And other side will say, well, people will do a better job managing the resource than a top-down government. So it's a big debate within the conservation community itself.
But do people follow the law, what the government says? In Brazil, for example, we have very strict laws, and it doesn't work in many places. Usually when a frontier is more established, then it sort of works, right? But in the beginning, it is just people are not following the law unless there is a very strong enforcement that creates all social economic problems for local people.
Yeah, well, that's a difference with Brazil, because you have in the Amazon, it's such a vast territory that it's so hard to enforce. In India, it's, there's people are packed in much more closely, so there's there's a lot more I'd say interaction between authorities and local people, and often not in a positive way. But if people, if they have no choice but to collect fuel wood from forests, it really doesn't matter what the law says.
Yeah, following up, so for a long time, I came from the ecological sort of side, and then always looking at the impacts for a long time of human activities on forests. And you started your work a bit like that, right? Looking at the drivers and the consequences of land use change and deforestation. But more recently, more been looking at the feedback that destruction of forests or deforestation or forest degradation have on people. So I was just curious to know, how do you see this now interact with the big crisis we're experiencing now? So how the forest, this contact with the forest boundaries, these frontiers are suffering from with this big crisis.
Yeah. Well, we don't know, but it is possible that um, access to forests and healthy forests can be uh, help people cope with a crisis like we're having now, as people get, you know, disconnected from the supply chains that they're used to getting their essentials from. That it is possible that access to healthy forests might confer some resilience. We don't know. We're just starting to do some studies about that to see if we can sort out that question. Um, so that's one possibility. Another possibility is that people put more pressure on forests, and those two things are not mutually exclusive. And we hear the reports that are coming out from Africa and other places that there is an increase bushmeat hunting and more pressure on wildlife for that kind of local consumption, because people, that's what they have to do to survive.
Yeah, here in the Xingu, also with the indigenous reserves, there are different accounts. It's more conversations we're having that people are cultivating more slash and burn systems because there is a great less dependence on external food source from the government or from the
Yeah.
city. So that's very interesting. So to finish, Ruth, I would just like you to say a few words for these students who are finishing their degrees in earth system science or social ecology or even chemistry, and want to work on this interface between global change and forest conservation. Um,
Yeah, well, first of all, for those of you who are interested in working at that interface, thank you. We need people who can think in this systems kind of way and think about the social sides of questions along with the ecological sides and the political sides and economic sides, put the whole story together. So thank you for stepping into that space. It's not easy. And I will say something that doesn't make sense for this particular moment, but this moment will lift. And what I want to say is just get out there with open eyes and open mind, and get on the ground and listen to people and look at what's going on. And we learn so much more uh, from immersing ourselves in places and with people than we can ever learn from satellite data or sitting behind a computer. Not that that's a bad thing to do, but we have to work together to put all our methods together. And those methods, in my mind, include getting out into the field.
Thank you so much, Ruth. And if you, again, thank you for sharing some of the thoughts with the students. And we're going to have a discussion with about this conversation. And I'm going to send you some of the students' thoughts. Usually are very, very helpful.
Okay, that'd be great. Thank you.